I think Netflix's Shadow and Bone might just be on a bunch of people's watch list. It's a fantasy tale with some darkness and intrigue, but is it worth binging? Shadow and Bone finds us in a war-torn world where lowly soldier and orphan Alina Starkov has just unleashed an extraordinary power that could be the key to setting her country free from a terrifying darkness. As she struggles to hone her power, she finds that allies and enemies can be one and the same, and that nothing in this lavish world is what it seems. I know I say this a lot, but I haven't read the books that this show is based on. I'll probably check them out at some point though, just to see how well the show matches up. This takes place in a time where the people still travel by horse and carriage, but they also have steam engines. The costumes look like they're out of the late 1800s-ish era, with an Eastern European or maybe even Russian flair. It's kind of a mystical place because living amongst the regular people are some people with special abilities. They're called the Grisha, and they can do various things like make and control fire with their hands. They can heal people, create wind, affect a person's heartbeat, and even fashion special devices. Separating the lands is this large, dark, misty cloud type thing called the Fold. It's pretty far across and it stretches for a really long way side to side. It's also wickedly high, so it's not something that can be easily avoided or maneuvered around. Inside are threats and dangers that can also make crossing it very dangerous. Now, the first episode is a lot to take in. There's a bunch of information that comes at us, including locations and people. Now, while it was a little daunting at the outset, it did become very easy to follow what was going on and who was whom later on in the series. There are a handful of major players to the story, and then even more that are secondary. So the characters are stacked to give us a bunch to carry the story. I liken it a tiny bit to Game of Thrones, where we have a few different stories going on with groups of characters in different lands, and we hope that at some point they're all going to tie in together. So there are a lot of things to examine in this first season of the show. First, the main characters, they might surprise you. There were a few that at the beginning I just didn't click with, but by the end they were some of my favorites. They kind of segment off the characters into traits, so you'll have one character who is cocky but his talents can back up his claims. You have another who is very pragmatic and almost callous. There's the warrior type who is loyal, and then another who is the reluctant hero. Now, they don't exclusively have claim to these traits, but each of the characters makes one their dominant trait. There are also a couple of characters that I'm curious to see how they develop later on, because I have my theories on who or what they might be. Some elements are shown quickly in scenes, which leads me to suspect some hidden abilities or talents. Now, I think the pace was laid out pretty nicely. While we have the action and drama playing out in front of us, we get flashbacks at various times to create more backstory or support current motivations. As I watched, I didn't feel rushed, aside from maybe that first or second episode a bit, but that was more due to the amount of information that was just coming at me. Besides that, the show kept me engaged, but also in suspense as events would unfold. It created the right amount of drama and tension without becoming melodramatic. The few different storylines that are going on became easy to follow too, but I did find myself trying to figure out where they were leading or how they'd converge, or if they'd converge. I think that ultimately it worked out really well because the story would focus on a group and a storyline for a while, moving their narrative along, and then it'd switch to another character or group and tell more of their tale. The story really gained intensity in the second half of the season, though. We've had a bunch of the establishment of characters and the story set up in the first half, and then more of the action begins, and we really get into the meat of the narrative. Motivations become more clear from certain characters, and that just only works to up the excitement. The special effects in this are surprisingly reserved. With all the different types of abilities out there, I kind of expected to see more stuff being shown. But like when a Grisha would make wind, we'd watch their movements, they do some weird hand movements, which create the wind, and then we see its effects on something, but not the wind itself. And I know that that would be odd, but I also know that sometimes stories want to show the ability more, even if it doesn't make sense. So in that sense, it did make sense that it wasn't used, or wasn't shown. But on the flip side, there was fire that was used, and it looked great. I found two of the darker things really impressive too. First I liked the look and the atmosphere of the Fold. Now sure, it's dark and kind of cloudy or smoky in appearance, but it creates this suffocating area that you know is just full of danger. And sometimes you can hear the dangers, but not see them. And I thought that was a scary proposition to hear that which might kill you, but not be able to see it coming. Another effect that was used that I really liked was a weapon used by one of the Grisha. It's brutal and quick, and when it's used, the effect is pretty impressive. Now, there were also some creatures that we get to see, and I'm not sure if they're a mix of practical effects and CGI or what, but they looked good and freaky. There are a lot of twists to the story, but I don't know, maybe a better term is an ongoing series of setbacks for several of the characters. These work to make the story intriguing and always moving in a forward direction. It also creates tension for us as viewers, as well as between the players. So like I said, there are a few storylines going on, but there's one that's kind of on the sidelines. And for the majority of the show, I felt that this one was almost a distraction. I mean, this didn't mean that I wasn't intrigued by the characters, because I just wasn't sure how this was tying into the overall larger story. And I wouldn't say this was a throwaway storyline, but for a large portion of it, I really was wondering about its purpose. There are 8 episodes this first season, and each are around that 50-ish minute mark. And once I got my feet under me as far as what the story was about, and more importantly, who the players were in that first and second episode, the show became more and more entertaining. Overall, I had a good time watching this. I got sucked into several of the characters, and because of some of the character growth, I began to really root for those that I didn't care for at first. I'm curious to see where the show is headed, and I like how it left off. I think we're in store for even more excitement, action, and treachery. There's some sex, a little nudity, some profanity, and a lot of violence. I give Shadow and Bone 4 out of 5 couches. So are you excited to see this one? Are you a fan of the books? Who's your favorite character from the books? Share it below in the comments. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.